How to make UHMW combat archery bolts for the SCA. So I am going to be building to what is the current East Kingdom standards. Today's date is August 29th, 2020. This handout is from June 2016. It is actually slightly more strict than the version of the rules that are about to be updated for the East Kingdom. Since I'm editing the rules, I'm aware that the tagging requirements are going to change slightly, which I'll go over. Um, Anytime you are building combat archery ammo, you need to understand how to inspect the ammo so that way you know how to build it, because what are they going to check for? Um, so a UHMW is ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. That is what the head is made out of, the blunt. This shape is kind of the minimum amount of material that you can have. It is referred to as a Lu-Shan after the person who developed it. So the requirement is that you have an 1.25 cylinder of the UHMW that has a 1/2 inch deep hole and a 1/2 inch of material in front of the hole. So that, and then you can remove extra material so that for aerodynamics. So you have to have your full diameter for the 1/2 inch. The new rules in the Society Handbook and the Lu-Shans are all made this way, require this round over before it was, I believe, recommended on the front edge. The hole itself is normally slightly undersized, so that way once you force this shaft in, it really doesn't move much. Unfortunately, UHMW is very slippery, so you kind of need that. If you do an exact drilled hole, it tends to work its way loose. They do make these in both white and black. It's the same material, so either's legal. If it is a dowel, you would need to round that back corner also to make sure that there are no sharp edges. You can make these yourself, but I highly recommend that if you do it, that you talk to somebody, well, and especially if they're just the straight ones. Drilling that hole dead center is extremely difficult to do. If you have a friend who has a small lathe, that is, well, a small metal lathe, because a wood lathe won't do it, then you can chuck it up, drill your hole very precisely to make them. Trying to do it on a drill press, it's difficult. It's going to take a lot of setup time to make sure that your hole is centered. This style of head can be used with a fiberglass shaft that is between 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch. If you use a pre-made APD, these are only made to 1/4 inch. So if that's the case, you have to use a 1/4 inch shaft. The most common supplied in the SCA is going to be a 1/4 inch shaft. And that shaft is fiberglass, and it is a pultruded fiberglass, so they are physically pulling the fibers as it's getting glued up and going through the die, instead of forcing it through by pushing, which causes the fibers to kind of curl up on themselves, and it's not as strong of a fiberglass. If you try to buy fiberglass like those markers for your driveway, is most likely extruded and the wrong type of fiberglass. If you're best off when buying your fiberglass to go to somebody who's been selling for the SCA Combat Archery community. The one that holds the molds for the Asgard APDs and the fat heads is a company called North Star Archery. They're out of Trimaris. Good company. Because they are the primary supplier, they often have very long lead times, especially before Penzik, so you're going to need to plan ahead with your purchase. The two heads that you can currently buy, this is a Fathead 1. There's actually a Fathead 2 because the original mold that makes these died. Or the Lu-Shan, the UHMW heads. For the anti-penetration device, the APD, you have a choice of an Asgard, which there are actually 3 types of Asgards, left-handed, right-handed, and bolt. A crossbow can actually fire the left and right-handed if you go ahead and cut off the arrow nock. There are some crossbows, like a roller nut, that requires this stud to extend back, and for that they have the solid stud crossbow style, but I've been doing this before those were available, so my crossbow was built expecting this to be cut flat and actually misfires if I use the solid ones. I actually find it easier to cut off the little bits than it is to cut off the solid piece, so I still buy the arrow ones and modify them to crossbow for my crossbow. Your crossbow may be different, so check with whoever built your crossbow to see which style APDs you want to use if you're using the pre-made Asgards. You can also make your own APDs, and if you're using a 5/16 or a 3/8 rod, you have to make your own. And those are going to be out of plastic pipe. The old term is Silaflex. I'm trying to remember what the new SCA rules are. I think it's plastic pipe or tubular APD. There are specific material requirements for this pipe. So look at the rules. Talk to somebody who's purchased them before to make sure that you're doing it right. There's, I think, more savings in doing the Lu-Shan heads than the pipe APDs. So I build this style. It's partially when I started playing. Your choice was a classic Balder head or this, and at the time the Lu-Shans flew a little bit more accurately than the classic Balders, since they've added in more padding on the Lu-Shan, and the fat head is a little more aerodynamic than the classic Balder. Accuracy-wise, I think you could go either way. This is more of a money output. This is more of a time output or investment. So we've talked about the heads, talked about the shaft, talked about the APD. So when you're inspecting, I'm going to go with one that is assembled. Do I have one handy in front of me? There we go. So for an assembled bolt, or for an arrow, there's a 28-inch length maximum, which is from the back of the APD, from the back of the blunt to the back of the APD. The nock does not count, so it's the back ring. And so that can only be 28 inches. It's really important for the arrows because otherwise it allows you to draw more and get more power out of your bow, which, since your bow is weighed at 28 inches, it's important that you can only draw to 28 inches. So the head itself, the foam must be resilient. The old rules before 2020 just said it had to be foam. It now needs to be resilient foam. So it needs to have at least a 1/2 inch of foam in front of the APD and it needs to have resilient foam to pad it out to 2.5 inches. Now that only needs to touch the sides of the gauge, but it needs to come back a 1/2 inch onto the APD. So this is an older head that is actually a little smaller than the current ones. It doesn't fully touch all the way around, but more importantly than that, back here on the blunt, we can actually squeeze and feel the plastic. Now, if this was a cylinder where it was 1 inch long, we would only need padding the first 1/2 inch. You could still have exposed plastic, but the way the Lu-Shans are made with that back cut, you need to pad to that back cut. And I know some of the foam that I have that's older is starting to get worn, and I actually need to cut it off and rebuild. And since I have one that's been cut off, you can actually see the parts. So there is a disc of foam. I actually use 3/4 of an inch to make sure that if things compress, that I still have a 1/2 inch in front of the blunt. I use a piece of camper mounting tape was what I was using for a long time. This is 1.25 inches by 3/16. I don't know. I must not have assembled this one because it's self-adhesive, but the little paper is left behind. The self-adhesive makes it nice. Unfortunately, I am finding the camper foam only has like a 4 to 5 season life, and then it starts to get too soft and is no longer resilient. I have switched over, and unfortunately I've had to custom order this, a mini cell. I don't know what foam they are selling from North Star in their kits. I haven't actually bought from them in years because I bought so much that I've just been slowly assembling it. If you live in the East Kingdom and you want it, I have a lot of this 1/4 inch by 1.25 inch foam that I will give you. It's got a self-adhesive layer on it. I bought quite a bit. They were supposed to send me 3/16. Half it came in 1/4 inch, so I'm more than willing to give away the 1/4 inch until I run out. So those are the parts. Now for what needs to happen to each part. We talked about the foam on the front. The blunt cannot rotate more than, I believe it's 1/8 of an inch at the collar to the shaft. I'd have to double check that. Really, you shouldn't see any under the test loads that we're doing. You don't want to crank too hard because you'll end up breaking the glue joints. And honestly, I've seen people test the ammo in a way that can guarantee it to fail every time. So the way we do it is you hold the shaft in your hand, you hold the head, and you twist. It should move on the shaft in your hand. You shouldn't be able to hold on. Unfortunately, if you do enough testing, you will get blisters on your hand. So that's how much force twisting, and then pull and make sure that it doesn't pull off. You may also want to try and wiggle it. That's more important on the pre-made shafts because, or the pre-made heads, the rubber that is in them, you can actually seat this down and not get it all the way inside. And once it's taped down, it doesn't pull off, but it wiggles. And that's going to be a failure. That you normally only see our new ammo once it's been seated properly and passed the first time. Hopefully you'll never see that issue again because they keep driving in deeper when every time they're used. So the shaft of the fiberglass itself needs to be taped. That needs to be sturdy, resilient tape, which is normally defined as electrical, fiberglass, or duct tape. If you have another tape, double check the reading of the rules, run it past a marshal before you try to assemble that way, just to make sure you won't get into problems. You should not have little bits of your tape dying. You can trim those off. I don't see, there's my knife. You can trim them off a little bit because the tape I use is 1 inch, so it actually goes around and overlaps. As long as it is still continuously taped, it is okay. Once I start cutting in and it is no long, it now has bare fiberglass rod, then it's going to fail. This bit sticking up can unfortunately cause kind of a paper cut as it goes past somebody, so you don't want to have the flagging. This is probably at just about the point where it's too much. It's more than 1/8 of an inch, so this is going to fail. You're just going to need to replace your tape. On your shaft, you need to have a label that has your name. It is not clearly defined if that is your real name or your SCA name, so you can use either. And your kingdom. I like to put in my province or your barony or whatever your local group is, so that way somebody, especially when you're a new fighter, you can say, oh hey, that person's in your area, do you know who this is, so I can return it to them. The shaft itself needs to still be structurally sound. This is a very rare damage, but sometimes there is a delamination inside the fiberglass. That's pretty much allowing the fibers to move, which causes kind of a slight rubbing sound. It's very hard to hear. So you hold it up next to your ear, you flex the shaft, and then roll it. And that, once held next to your ear, you can hear just a little kind of sound. If you hear that, this shaft is dangerous. You might be able to recover the ends, but that shaft needs to be retired. The APD itself, there are a couple of different, unfortunately they were all made from the same mold, well, same basic mold since they have the different types of nocks. But the material that they cast them in is a little different over the years. So it needs to be back and round. If it's not back and round, you can normally convince it to go back to round. If it won't go back to round, then you need to retire it. Some of the more modern ones are more brittle. It's a much firmer plastic. So this is one of the, I shouldn't say new. It was a batch that was made and sold for a couple of years. And I believe they actually have finally sold through those, and you shouldn't be receiving these anymore if you're buying new. But when you squeeze it, it really doesn't move much. So this is about the same amount of pressure, and I've got a lot of movement on this one that's about 10 years old. These firm ones tend to develop a hairline crack right down here and then shatter. So if you can get your thumbnail into a crack, that's going to cause it to fail. Sometimes, even just during the manufacturing process, these get made wrong. I should have put something inside here to make it a little more easy to see. So this one, that hole for the shaft was not centered properly. And so, although nothing happened to this is the way it was purchased, this is actually going to fail. North Star's pretty good about giving you returns, but as a marshal, I kind of like having the demo. The only modification you can make to an Asgard APD is to cut off the nock, flush with the ring. I mean, you could leave it longer, but you can't go any further past the ring. Or to poke a hole into it to help the air and the glue escape while you're trying to seat it. I like to do that on the inside, so that way I don't create a bump which could throw off if I forget to remove the excess glue before I use it. If I missed anything on the inspection. Head doesn't rotate, doesn't wiggle. I mean, and always as you're learning, go back to the rules, go back to your society, go back to your kingdom, double check. Did I mention? So it needs to at least touch the size of an 1.5-inch hole. Unfortunately, most Marshall gauges don't have that hole. You can have somebody make one. You could also, just like a regular stick gauge, have somebody cut a piece that's exactly an 1.5 inches wide, so you can test that way. You will occasionally, unfortunately, there were manufactured heads that are illegal to use on shafted ammo. This is a classic Balder. So the classic Balder was cast in 2 pieces for a long time, and you will see, and it's incredibly hard to see, well, this one doesn't have it. There would be a mold parting line right around the ring. Thought I had at least, there it is. So the mold parting line you can see on this, if I can get it to go into focus, not really. It's faint. It is super hard to see, but there is a slight extra bit of material in a ring around that tells us that there were 2 pieces of the mold pushed together and a little extra material ended up in between. A 2-part classic Balder is legal on fiberglass ammo if it was designed with a 1/4-inch hole. There were some that were designed for arrow shafts and a larger diameter. Those are not legal even if that is the diameter fiberglass that's put into it. It needs to have a piece of, any of the manufactured heads needs to have a continuous piece of tape that goes up over the head and back down and is secured. The tape has dried out and is no longer continuous, so that will fail it also. For a Fathead 1, it's going to have both a parting line and this extra buildup of material that was cut more like here on the Fathead, the Cub 2, I think it is, which never saw mass production. It saw some pre-production, but they're out there, so you need to be able to see the head. If you have any type of pre-manufactured head, you're going to need to be able to go in and actually see the head. You can't fully tape over it because the marshals need to be able to identify what type of head it is inside there. I wish I had a picture of the Fathead 2. That would have been useful. The Fathead 2 is the only commercially manufactured blunt that is in current production for new purchase. You may see older stuff out there. There are different styles that are illegal. This was the Balder Egg. This is, I don't know if you can see well, it's a clear casting, clear rubber. This and the other style of clear rubber, they are both illegal. There was a UHMW with a Super Ball in front of it. That is illegal. The marshmallow heads, if built to the standard we're doing, will be legal. There is what is called a Fell Walker. This is a larger piece of UHMW. It's designed to be fired from a heavy crossbow. That is specifically banned in the East Kingdom. It is legal in other kingdoms. A 2-piece classic Balder legal, 1 piece. And the reason the 1 piece is illegal is actually the core inside it was built differently and has a tendency to shatter. And then a Fathead. talked about the APDs. So when you're making your own APDs, they can either be cut just straight, or they can be aerodynamically cut. The exact measurements are in the rules. I don't make these. I don't have them memorized, so I go back to the rules when inspecting those. So that's inspecting. I'm going to take a pause here, and then we'll talk about building.